I'm a guy, and I was 26 at the time of this story. This happened way back in 2012. I was working on a cruise ship and we had a port of call in Istanbul, Turkey. It was one of those few times a year we actually make an overnight stay, so I decided to make the best out of the long time we had in port. I normally go out touring on my own unless I have somewhere specific I want to go with friends. I started going around town at around 6 p.m. and ended up in the marketplace, which was interesting, but not that great. Also, the walk from the ship there went by a long bridge, so by the end I was really tired, but had to get back to work. When I got back to the ship, my friends were all telling me about the mosques and how amazing they were. I had missed these because I went wandering on my own with no clue where I was headed. I got some instructions of how to get there, and decided to head over to get some pictures after my shift was done at midnight. By the time I got into town and was well underway of gazing at the beautiful city of Istanbul, it was around 2:30 a.m. All my friends thought I was insane for going out on my own at that time in an unknown Middle East city, but I've never been paranoid. I just make sure I stay safe by watching where I go and keeping an eye of my surroundings at all times. I also am not a scaredy cat, so I don't mind looking like a tourist. I had a map out in the open, planning my next stop, and my tablet out taking pictures. But again, not oblivious either, as I kept watching around if I was being targeted by anyone. At one point, I was taking a picture, and this guy in a gray suit who was standing in a corner nearby me shouts at me, "Welcome to Istanbul." What I thought was strange of him is he seemed out of place. He was well groomed, nice haircut, a bit of expensive looking jewelry, mostly rings and a fancy watch. Also, he was the first person I had seen in a suit all day. I told him thank you and continued as I was, as I had little interest of chatting up a random stranger. He started walking up to me with a huge charming smile and started making small talk about where I'm from and such. My alert lights went off in my head, mostly because some random guy started talking to me at 2:30 a.m. in a city I'm unfamiliar with. So again, I stood alert, but I was not paranoid, and I had no intentions of being rude. So I answered some of his questions and made small talk with him. He went on to tell me that the place I'm taking pictures of is crap and there are better areas in a different place. He started showing me on my map where I should have gone, which was nearby. He also went on to tell me he was in town for business and he was staying in a hotel nearby, which he pointed out on the map. I thanked him for the information on where to go and he stopped me, telling me that there's no point in going there as it was all closed during nighttime. He pointed out a faraway area of the map and told me it was a much better place to go. This was actually a spot my friends had told me about that was full of bars and restaurants, and I had actually told them I might meet up with them there later. He then told me he was on his way there now and offered me to come along with him. The red flag in my head now was waving at me more furiously. One thing is to be nice to a tourist. Going out of your way for it starts getting odd. I thanked him for the offer but told him I'd be on my way. He asked me where I was going and I told him I'd be heading over to the first area he mentioned. He bidded me goodbye and was friendly enough about it, not being too insistent on me going with him, so I relaxed a bit. As I was walking away from him, I pretended to take a picture of a building next to me just to glance in his direction and make sure I wasn't being followed. I couldn't see him anywhere, so I brushed it off as it not being anything. As I walked toward the area he had pointed out in the map, I did see some great structures, which proved at least he wasn't lying to me about how good a place it was to take pictures. However, it was a much more secluded area, and I realized I was completely alone on the street, except for two girls walking far away, and a faraway restaurant with people sitting outside. I walked down a very wide sloped street and looked around to see where I should go if anything were to happen. There was a small alley shortly behind me that seemed to lead back to a more populated area. As I walked down the street, I saw a car approaching from the street at high speed. By now my senses had become a bit silly, and I remember thinking to myself that if the car rushed towards me, this street was sloped enough that I could probably leap over it. I kind of laughed to myself until I noticed the car actually changed its course to head towards me. Considering how ridiculously wide the street was, this made no sense. I was preparing to bolt through my designated escape route, but the car stopped a few meters away, and the window slowly rolled down. I laughed to myself again, thinking that the person inside was going to ask me for directions. And since I saw it was only one person, and I didn't want to be a jerk about it, I approached the car, and surprised, it was the same guy in the suit. By now, I knew 100% there was something wrong, and I had to get the hell out of there. He asked me what I was doing, and by now, I wasn't so courteous anymore. I firmly told him I was taking pictures. He waved with his hand for me to get in, saying, "Come on, there's nothing here. It's boring. Let me show you where it's more fun. I went to get my car so we can get there fast." I remember thinking to myself, the car came from my direction completely opposite of where he had told me his hotel was. I politely told him no thank you and that I was fine, but he insisted, saying that we should get a drink. I then told him that I don't drink, which is actually a true statement. He then started to get a bit aggravated and said, "Whatever, man. It doesn't have to be alcohol. You can have a coffee or tea. Let's go see some belly dancers." I pointed to the ring on my finger and told him I wasn't interested and that I was married. He then replied, "So what? I'm married and I have a daughter. There's nothing wrong with watching belly dancers." I should also mention that I have a personality that really does not like conflict, and sometimes to avoid it, I end up doing things I don't want to do to please other people or to get them to shut up. Because I knew about this part of my personality, I strongly told myself in my head that if I got in this car, I was going to regret it for the rest of my life. I could just picture it. He would need to make a random stop somewhere where 4 other guys would pop out and take my kidney. He then said one more time, "Come on, what's the problem?" I decided I had enough. I raised my voice and got defensive and told him I wasn't scared of him, but I wasn't dumb enough to get in a car with a complete stranger. He waved dismissively and started to drive off. As he was driving off, I continued to walk down the street, the same way I was walking before, making sure he could see me as I did. Then as soon as he was out of sight, I backed up and ran towards the small alley back into the more crowded areas. I really have no idea what this guy wanted and where he really wanted to take me, but I am so thankful that I did not get into his car. When I was about 15, I went on a cruise with my parents around Asia. One night, I was making my way back to the kids' club after changing into my swimsuit at my cabin. My mom insisted that I join so I could meet new people. It was around about midnight, and since around 90% of the people on the ship were elderly, they were already in bed, so everywhere I went was empty. My cabin was on the lowest level of the ship, whereas the pool was on the top deck, so I had a fair way to go to get there. After waiting for one of the 6 elevators to open for 5 minutes, I got impatient and ran for the stairs. That's when I heard someone from behind me asking why was I running away from them. I turned around and a man, who looked to be in his late 20s and dressed from head to toe in gray, was grinning at me. Unsure of how to act, I gave him a slight smile and tried to keep walking, but he moved fast and blocked my path. He asked me all kinds of questions, ranging from what was my name, how old I was, where was I from, why was I so uncomfortable around him. I managed to lie and say my parents were waiting for me, and before he answered, I walked away, then ran when I couldn't see him. Somewhere between 1:30 and 2 o'clock in the morning, I said goodbye to my new friends and started to head towards the stairs again. And unfortunately for me, I ran into the same guy. The man was coming up the stairs when I was about to go down, and as soon as he spotted me, he grinned. He was purposefully blocking my way, and his questions were getting more and more personal. He kept telling me I had a pretty smile and that I was beautiful, and he offered to walk me to my cabin. At this point, my gut was telling me to get away fast. That was the second time I ran into him, and it was on the same floor. I began to think that his cabin was on that floor and was worrying what he could do. Every time he said something, I replied with, "I have to go," and eventually I could see he was getting angry. This went on for several minutes. More questions, more compliments, and even some touching, which I pushed him off. He hit the wall beside us once, when I wasn't giving him the answers he wanted. But then he took a deep breath and smiled at me. I was beginning to get really scared, so I turned around, ran through the glass doors behind me to the pool deck, and collided with one of the boys from the club. I began to panic, convinced he was coming after me. I was talking too fast and hyperventilating, and my friend had no idea what was going on. I turned around to point the man out, but he wasn't there anymore. I told my parents what happened, which led to my dad walking me to the club every night. My mom was determined to find out who he was, so she and I went to the little photo shop on one of the decks and looked through the mandatory photos that each passenger had taken before they got on the ship. To my horror, he wasn't in a single photo. I never saw him again after that. It was as if he wasn't even on the boat. I still wonder what could have happened if I hadn't ran away and found my friend. I still wonder whether or not he was real. Besides, no one but me saw him. My grandparents decided to take the whole family on a cruise at Christmas time around the Caribbean. There were 14 of us, so we were all located in different cabins spread over different floors. My sister and myself shared a room. I was 16 and my sister was 14. On our first night, we could hardly sleep as the couple in the adjoining cabin were having a very loud argument. The man kept calling the girl a whore and shouted that she was only there because of his money. It went on until the early hours of the morning. After that one night, all was quiet and I assumed that the girl had moved to another cabin, as I had never seen or heard her again. The next day we were up early for breakfast. I was keen to explore the ship and my sister was taking a while to get ready. I thought if I waited in the corridor that I would encourage her to hurry up. While I was waiting in the corridor, I heard the next door opening, and I couldn't help but look to see who the man was that had been doing all of the shouting. He looked at me and his eyes lit up straight away. This horrible feeling came over me. The feeling I know now is gut instinct. I just knew from the way that he looked at me that he was bad news. He looked to be in his 40s and looked fairly normal, but I couldn't stop the shivers traveling up my spine. He said hello, but all I could manage was a faint smile. I decided I'd head back into the room. As I was tapping on the door, the man was walking down the corridor to the elevators, but repeatedly looking back to look at me. From that point on, he seemed to be everywhere. In the dining room at lunch, he would sit close by. At the pool, he would only be a few lounge chairs away. A couple of times, I got in elevators only to have him run in behind me, even though I hadn't seen him around before I entered the lift. Luckily, even though I wasn't with my family, there had always been other people in the lift when he ran in. All he did was stand and stare at me, and I would get shivers down my back. The first couple of days I tried to ignore it. I had always gotten attention from boys, so I tried to just brush it off as a bit of attention, but something didn't seem right. Especially since the ship we were on was massive and there were so many people on board, I started to find it hard to believe that he would just randomly bump into me. We had told my mom and dad and the others about the argument in the other room from the first night, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything about the man following me. I felt embarrassed, which I do realize now was very silly of me. Near the end of the week on the cruise, I wanted to leave the pool and get changed to go watch a movie with my cousins. My sister wanted to stay at the pool, so I headed to the room by myself. When I got in the elevator with another few people, I noticed a man sneaking at the end, and all I could feel was dread as he stared at me. The other people on the lift got off at our stop but went in another direction. As I walked down the corridor to my room, I could feel the man's eyes on the back of my neck. I quickly sped up and hurried into my room. A minute passed and there was a knock at my door. Immediately, I knew it was him. There had been no one else in the corridor. The knocks continued as I panicked on what I should do. I thought I would have to answer the door because he had watched me enter and knew I was there. Stupidly, I answered the door and the man had the creepiest smile on his face. He called me a sweet girl and then told me that he was locked out of his room and wanted to come into mine to use the phone. I immediately knew he was lying, so quickly I thought of something to get out of the situation. I told him that our phone wasn't working and I tried to shut the door. He then asked if I was Scottish in a surprised voice. I mumbled something in agreement, shutting the door, but he stuck his foot in. I decided to use all my strength and batter the door against his foot. He cried out in pain, but put his other foot in place, and then said he just needed to come in for just a minute. He kept shouting at me. I told him he should just go to the reception and continue to try to shut the door. The panic was flooding through me. The next minute, I heard someone say my name and ask what was going on. With relief, I realized it was my older male cousin Jason coming by so we can go watch the film. He then shouted at the man asking who he was. The guy then apologized and said that he thought we were Scottish and that he knew one of our friends back from the United States. He then mumbled that it was all just a big misunderstanding. He hopped away and proceeded to enter his room. We left the next morning and I didn't see him again. I will never forget that creepy expression he had on his face every time he looked at me. It makes me sick to my stomach.